What if civilization did not make human beings better? What if the very things we celebrate as progress, cities, wealth, culture, and power, quietly pushed humanity further away from freedom and compassion? In the 18th century, one restless thinker began asking these uncomfortable questions, arguing that society itself might be responsible for inequality and corruption. His ideas would challenge kings, inspire revolutions, and forever change the way people think about freedom, education, and the relationship between the individual and society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born on June 28, 1712, in the small Republic of Geneva, a city proud of its independence and shaped by Protestant traditions of civic responsibility and modest living. His arrival into the world, however, was marked by immediate tragedy. Only days after giving birth, his mother died from complications, leaving the newborn without ever truly knowing her. This loss became one of the quiet emotional shadows of his life, something he would later reflect upon with deep feeling. In many of his writings, he spoke about human sensitivity, compassion, and emotional bonds with unusual intensity. And some historians believe that the absence of a mother's presence during his earliest days left a permanent mark on the way he understood human affection and vulnerability. His father, Isaac Rousseau, worked as a watchmaker. Though not wealthy, he possessed a lively mind and a love for literature. During the evenings, father and son would often sit together reading books aloud. These readings included stories from classical history, tales of ancient Rome and Greece, and romantic narratives filled with heroic characters and moral struggles. For the young boy, these sessions opened a doorway into imagination and reflection. He encountered stories about Republican virtue, courage, and citizens devoted to the public good. The ancient republics described in these books seemed to represent societies where honor, independence, and civic responsibility shaped the character of individuals. Those early readings would quietly influence his later thinking about politics and society. The image of small republics filled with engaged citizens remained powerful in his imagination. At the same time, his childhood environment was not entirely stable. His father's temperament was energetic but unpredictable, and his life took an unexpected turn after a dispute with another man led to legal trouble. Facing possible punishment, the watchmaker was forced to leave Geneva. The young boy, still very small, was suddenly separated from the parent who had guided his early education. With his father gone, he was sent to live with relatives and later placed under the supervision of a Protestant minister in the countryside outside Geneva. This period introduced him to a quieter world far removed from the noise of urban life. Surrounded by fields, forests, and hills, he spent long hours exploring the natural environment. The landscape seemed peaceful and unstructured compared with the rigid expectations of city society. These early experiences with nature created a deep impression that would later become central to his philosophy. He began developing the feeling that human beings might be more genuine, more peaceful, and more content when living closer to nature rather than within the complex systems of civilization. As he grew older, his guardians attempted to prepare him for a practical profession. Like many boys of modest background in 18th century Europe, he was eventually placed into an apprenticeship. The hope was that he would learn a trade that would allow him to support himself in adult life. He was sent to work with an engraver, a craftsman who produced detailed decorative designs on metal plates. The apprenticeship, however, quickly became a source of unhappiness. The master who supervised him used harsh discipline and frequent punishment. What was intended to be a path toward stability instead felt like confinement. The strict routine and constant criticism created a growing sense of frustration. He began feeling that the structure of society demanded obedience without understanding the natural emotions and desires of individuals. These experiences would later influence his belief that social institutions often impose artificial pressures that distort human character. At the age of 16, unable to tolerate the situation any longer, he made a dramatic decision. One evening, he left Geneva and began wandering beyond the borders of the city. This moment marked the beginning of a long and uncertain period of travel that would shape much of his early adult life. Without a stable career or clear destination, he moved through different regions of Europe, sometimes surviving through small jobs and the generosity of strangers. During these years, he encountered a variety of social environments. He lived briefly among peasants in rural villages, spent time serving in households, and occasionally attempted to establish himself as a music teacher. Each environment revealed a different side of society. In villages, he observed the simplicity of rural life, where daily routines were tied closely to the rhythms of nature. In cities, he saw more elaborate hierarchies of wealth and status, where appearances and reputation seemed to dominate social relationships. These observations slowly formed the foundation of his later reflections about inequality and social structure. He began noticing how strongly people compared themselves with others. Pride, jealousy, ambition, and competition seemed far more intense in sophisticated urban environments than in simpler communities. Music also became one of his deepest passions during these wandering years. He studied musical composition with great enthusiasm and believed that music expressed emotional truths that language sometimes struggled to capture. For a time, he hoped to build a career as a composer and teacher. Although his musical work never reached the lasting fame of his philosophical writings, the discipline of studying harmony and rhythm sharpened his sensitivity to human emotion and artistic expression. Eventually, his travels brought him to Paris, the intellectual heart of 18th century Europe. Paris during this period was alive with discussion and debate. Writers, scientists, philosophers, and artists gathered in salons where ideas about politics, science, religion, and society were discussed late into the night. It was the age of the Enlightenment, a movement that celebrated reason, scientific discovery, and the belief that human progress could be achieved through education and rational thought. At first, he entered this environment as an outsider struggling to survive financially. Life in Paris was expensive and competitive. Yet through acquaintances, he gradually began meeting individuals involved in the great intellectual project of the time, the Encyclopedia. This enormous work aimed to gather all human knowledge into a single collection of volumes, reflecting the Enlightenment belief that knowledge could transform society. Through these circles, he encountered many thinkers who believed strongly in the progress of civilization. According to their view, advances in science, art, and education were steadily improving the moral condition of humanity. Yet as he listened to these arguments, a quiet doubt began forming in his mind. He wondered whether the growth of civilization had truly made people happier or more virtuous. The turning point came during a journey outside the city when he encountered an announcement for an essay competition organized by an academic society. The question asked whether the progress of the arts and sciences had contributed to the improvement of moral life. While many readers assumed the answer would obviously be yes, he experienced a sudden and powerful realization that the opposite might be true. Driven by this insight, he wrote an essay arguing that advances in the arts and sciences had not necessarily improved human virtue. The essay suggested that civilization often encourages people to focus on appearance, reputation, and social comparison rather than genuine moral development. When the essay was submitted to the competition, it unexpectedly won first prize. Almost overnight, the unknown writer found himself at the center of intellectual debate across France. Some readers admired the boldness of the argument, while others were shocked by its challenge to the optimism of the Enlightenment. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most influential philosophical journeys of the 18th century. The ideas first expressed in that essay would eventually grow into powerful reflections about human nature, political authority, education, and the possibility of creating a society where individuals could live together while still preserving their freedom. The unexpected success of the essay changed the course of his life. Until that moment, he had been a struggling figure moving uncertainly through the intellectual world of Paris. Suddenly his name was being discussed in salons and among scholars who were intrigued by the boldness of his argument. Many Enlightenment thinkers have been celebrating the triumph of science, literature, and refined culture as clear signs of human progress. Yet this new voice was suggesting something deeply unsettling, that the very achievements people admired might also be responsible for corrupting human character. This argument did not mean that he rejected knowledge or learning entirely. What troubled him was the way society used these achievements to create systems of competition and prestige. In sophisticated societies, individuals often tried to impress one another with displays of talent, wealth, or reputation. Instead of focusing on genuine virtue or compassion, people became increasingly concerned with how they appeared in the eyes of others. Vanity and social comparison began shaping behavior in ways that were far removed from the simpler instincts of human nature. These reflections slowly grew into a larger philosophical question. If civilization had introduced inequality and artificial desires, what had human life been like before these developments? To explore this idea, he began examining the origins of social inequality. His thoughts eventually produced another important work that expanded the argument of the earlier essay. In this new study, he imagined the earliest stages of human existence, long before cities, governments, or complex economic systems had emerged. According to his interpretation, human beings in their natural condition were not violent monsters competing endlessly for power. Instead, they were relatively peaceful creatures whose basic needs were simple. Food, shelter, and occasional companionship were enough to sustain life. Because individuals were largely independent, they had little reason to dominate or exploit others. Two basic instincts guided behavior in this natural condition. One was self-preservation, the natural desire to survive and avoid harm. The other was a form of compassion, a spontaneous reluctance to see other living beings suffer. These instincts, he believed, formed the original moral foundation of humanity. Before the rise of complex societies, people did not require elaborate laws or institutions to regulate their behavior. Their natural sympathy for others helped prevent unnecessary cruelty. The situation began to change as human communities grew larger and more organized. Agriculture allowed individuals to settle permanently in certain places. Over time, land became something people claimed as their own. Once property appeared, new forms of inequality soon followed. Some individuals accumulated more resources than others, and differences in wealth gradually produced differences in power. With property came the need to protect possessions. Rules, agreements, and eventually governments were created to maintain order within growing communities. At first, these institutions may have seemed useful, but they also allowed certain individuals to secure advantages over others. According to this analysis, many political systems were built not to protect freedom, but to stabilize existing inequalities. The famous observation often associated with this argument describes the moment when the first person claimed ownership of land and convinced others to accept that claim. From that moment, he suggested, the foundations of social inequality were laid. Once property existed, society began dividing itself between those who possessed wealth and those who did not. These ideas were controversial because they challenged widely accepted beliefs about civilization. Many philosophers viewed the development of society as a clear improvement over the primitive conditions of early human life. By contrast, this new perspective suggested that progress had come with significant moral costs. Civilization had produced art, science, and technological advancement, but it had also created jealousy, competition, and systems of domination. Despite these criticisms, he did not argue that humanity should simply abandon society and return to primitive conditions. Such a return was neither possible nor desirable. Human beings had already developed complex relationships and institutions that could not easily disappear. The real challenge was finding a way to organize society so that individuals could live together while preserving their freedom and dignity. This question gradually became the central focus of his political philosophy. If existing political systems were built on inequality and domination, Could a different kind of social arrangement be created? Could individuals form a community where laws serve the common good rather than protecting the interests of a powerful minority? While reflecting on these issues, he continued living a complicated personal life. Financial stability remained uncertain, and his relationships with other intellectual figures were often tense. Although he had gained recognition, he sometimes felt uncomfortable within the sophisticated social world of Paris. The elaborate manners and competitive atmosphere of elite intellectual circles seemed to confirm his belief that civilization encouraged artificial behavior. At the same time, his literary activity expanded in new directions. In addition to philosophical essays, he began writing works that explored education, emotion, and human development. One of his goals was to understand how society shapes individuals from childhood onward. If human beings were naturally compassionate and free, then the institutions responsible for education must play a crucial role in either preserving or distorting those qualities. These reflections would soon lead him to develop some of the most influential ideas ever written about education and political community. He was searching for a vision of society that would protect human freedom rather than suppress it. The solution he eventually proposed would challenge traditional political authority and inspire generations of thinkers who believed that legitimate governments must rest on the collective will of the people rather than the power of kings or inherited privilege. As his reflections on inequality and human nature continued to deepen, he gradually turned his attention toward the central political question that had begun to trouble him more and more. If society had created systems of domination and dependence, was it possible to design a form of political community that preserved freedom instead of destroying it? This question would lead him to develop one of the most influential political theories ever written. The problem, as he saw it, was that human beings could not simply abandon society. Once communities had formed, once language, cooperation, and shared institutions had developed, individuals could not return to the isolated simplicity of early human life. People needed one another for protection, stability, and cooperation. Yet living together created a constant risk that some individuals would gain power over others. The challenge was to find a way for people to live collectively without sacrificing their independence. Out of this dilemma emerged the idea that would become the foundation of his most famous political work. Instead of viewing political authority as something imposed by kings or inherited through tradition, he argued that legitimate authority must originate from an agreement among free individuals. Each person, by entering into a collective agreement with others, would become part of a political community governed by laws that everyone had helped create. This agreement was not simply a contract in the ordinary sense. It represented a transformation in how individuals related to one another within society. By joining together, people formed what he described as a collective body guided by a common interest. The laws created by such a community would not serve a particular ruler or elite group. Instead, they would represent the shared will of the citizens themselves. This idea later became known as the concept of the general will. According to this view, a healthy political community should aim to express the common interest that benefits everyone rather than the private desires of particular individuals or factions. When citizens participate in forming laws that promote the collective good, they are not surrendering their freedom. Instead, they are exercising it by shaping the conditions under which they live. The argument was radical for its time because it challenged the dominant political structures of 18th century Europe. Most nations were ruled by monarchs whose authority was justified through tradition, divine right, or inherited privilege. By contrast, this new theory suggested that sovereignty ultimately belongs to the people themselves. Governments exist only because citizens allow them to exist. Such ideas would later influence major political movements, including revolutions that sought to replace absolute monarchy with systems based on popular participation. The notion that political authority should arise from the collective will of citizens helped reshape modern discussions about democracy and the legitimacy of government. While developing these political ideas, he was also exploring questions about human development and education. If society had the power to shape character so deeply, then the way children were raised must be of enormous importance. He believed that many traditional educational systems forced children into rigid patterns of obedience and competition too early in life. Instead of encouraging curiosity and natural growth, they often produced individuals who were anxious about status and approval. In response to this concern, he wrote a work that presented a new vision of education. Rather than treating children as miniature adults who must immediately conform to social expectations, the book suggested that education should follow the natural stages of human development. Childhood should be a time of exploration, physical activity, and gradual learning guided by experience rather than strict discipline. The central character of the book is a fictional student whose development is carefully guided so that curiosity and independence remain intact. Instead of memorizing abstract rules, the child learns through direct interaction with the world. Nature becomes the classroom, and the teacher's role is not to dominate, but to protect the natural unfolding of the student's abilities. This approach challenged many traditional assumptions about schooling. It suggested that society often damages the natural goodness of individuals by forcing them into artificial roles too early. True education, in his view, should prepare people to become free and thoughtful members of a community rather than obedient followers of authority. These ideas about education and politics soon attracted intense controversy. Some religious authorities believed his arguments threatened established moral teachings, while political leaders worried that his theories about popular sovereignty could encourage rebellion against existing governments. As a result, several of his books were condemned and banned soon after publication. Facing growing pressure from authorities, he was forced to leave France and seek refuge in other regions of Europe. The following years became a period of wandering once again. He moved through different cities and countries, sometimes welcomed by admirers and sometimes driven away by political suspicion. These constant changes of location created a life filled with uncertainty, yet they also reinforced his belief that society often treats independent thinkers with hostility. During these years of exile, he continued writing with remarkable determination. His works circulated widely despite official bans, influencing readers across Europe who were searching for new ways of understanding freedom, authority, and human nature. Admirers viewed him as a defender of individual independence and moral sincerity. Critics, however, often considered his ideas dangerously radical. Through all the controversies surrounding his life and writings, one central conviction remained constant. Human beings, he believed, were not naturally corrupt or malicious. The real problem lay in social arrangements that encouraged inequality, vanity, and domination. If societies could be reorganized around principles of shared responsibility and genuine participation, then individuals might regain a sense of freedom that civilization had gradually eroded. As the years passed and controversy surrounded many of his books, life became increasingly unsettled. Authorities in several regions viewed his writings with suspicion because they questioned both political and religious authority. After the publication of works that explored education and political legitimacy, official condemnation soon followed. Copies of his books were publicly burned in some places, and orders were issued for his arrest in others. Facing the threat of imprisonment, he was forced to leave France once again and begin another long period of movement across Europe. During these years, he traveled through Switzerland, Prussia, and England, often relying on the protection or sympathy of admirers who believe his ideas deserve to be heard. Some intellectuals welcomed him warmly, seeing him as a courageous thinker who had challenged powerful institutions. Yet life in exile was rarely peaceful. Suspicion and disagreement often followed him, and relationships with former friends sometimes deteriorated. His personality could be sensitive and defensive, especially when he believed he had been misunderstood or treated unfairly. One of the most unusual episodes of this period involved an invitation from the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume admired his writings and believed the controversies surrounding him in France had been exaggerated. Hoping to provide a calmer environment, he invited him to come to England where he could live safely and continue his work. At first, the arrangement appeared promising. Many British intellectuals were curious to meet the writer whose ideas about freedom and society had stirred such intense debate across Europe. However, the relationship between the two philosophers soon deteriorated in a surprising way. Suspicion and misunderstanding gradually grew, and he came to believe that Hume was secretly mocking or betraying him. Historians continue to debate whether these fears had any real foundation or whether they reflected a growing sense of insecurity that had developed after years of controversy and exile. Whatever the cause, the friendship ended in bitterness, and he eventually left England to return to the European continent once again. Despite these personal difficulties, he never stopped writing and reflecting. Much of his later work became more introspective, exploring the nature of memory, emotion, and personal identity. In a remarkable autobiographical work, he attempted to describe his life with unusual honesty, recounting both his achievements and his mistakes. Rather than presenting himself as a perfect hero, he described his fears, weaknesses, and moments of shame. This willingness to examine his own life in detail made the work one of the earliest examples of modern autobiographical literature. Through these reflections, he tried to understand how society shapes individual identity. Human beings are deeply influenced by the opinions and judgments of others, he observed. Reputation, approval, and criticism can affect the way individuals see themselves. Yet he believed that beneath these social pressures there exists a more authentic inner self, a natural sense of feeling and conscience that should guide moral decisions. This belief in the importance of authentic emotion distinguished his thinking from many other philosophers of the Enlightenment. While others emphasized reason and scientific analysis, he argued that moral life also depended on sympathy, compassion, and genuine feeling. Human beings were not simply calculating machines guided by cold logic. They possessed emotional instincts that connected them with one another. In his later years, he gradually returned to France after long periods of exile. By this time, his reputation had grown immensely across Europe. Readers were fascinated by his bold political ideas, his reflections on education, and his passionate defense of freedom and human dignity. Even those who disagreed with his conclusions recognized the power of his writing. Eventually, he was able to live more quietly, spending time reflecting on nature and writing about his experiences. Long walks remained one of his favorite activities. Wandering through forests and countryside landscapes provided moments of calm reflection that he often described with poetic detail. These solitary walks allowed him to reconnect with the natural world that had inspired so much of his philosophy. In 1778, after many years of intellectual struggle and wandering, his life came to an end near Paris. News of his death spread quickly across Europe. Although his ideas had been controversial, many readers recognized that he had profoundly changed the way people thought about society, freedom, and human nature. The influence of his work soon became visible in the political and philosophical movements that followed. His arguments about popular sovereignty helped inspire later debates about democracy and the legitimacy of government. The idea that political authority should arise from the collective will of citizens rather than from hereditary rulers became one of the defining principles of modern political thought. His writings on education also left a lasting mark. By emphasizing the importance of childhood development, curiosity, and learning through experience, he helped inspire new approaches to teaching that respected the natural growth of the individual. Many later educators drew inspiration from the belief that children should be allowed to explore the world and develop their abilities gradually rather than being forced into rigid systems of discipline. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of his legacy lies in his vision of human nature. He challenged the assumption that people are naturally selfish or corrupt. Instead, he suggested that many of the problems observed in society arise from social structures that encourage inequality, competition, and domination. By questioning these structures, He opened the possibility that societies could be organized in ways that protect both freedom and cooperation. The ideas he introduced continued influencing philosophers, political leaders, and reformers long after his lifetime. Discussions about democracy, citizenship, education, and social equality all carry traces of the questions he raised. His work encouraged readers to examine whether the institutions surrounding them truly served the common good or merely preserved existing hierarchies. In the end, the life that began in a modest household in Geneva became one of the most influential intellectual journeys of the 18th century. Through reflections on nature, society, and human freedom, he challenged the belief that civilization automatically leads to moral improvement. Instead, he asked a deeper question that continues to echo through modern political thought. If human beings are born free and capable of compassion, what kind of society must we build to preserve that freedom rather than destroy it?